Welcome, everybody, to the Detecting History podcast. And this is the Midweek History Extra, and this week in British history. This week in British history takes us back to January 1559, when Elizabeth I was crowned Queen of England at Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth was just 25 years old, and her ascension came at the moment of enormous tension. England had lurched violently between different religions, be it Catholic or Protestant, under her siblings Edward VI and Mary I. Elizabeth became queen on the 17th of November 1558, following the death of her half-sister Mary I. Mary died childless, and despite Elizabeth's long and often dangerous position during her sister's reign, including imprisonment in the Tower of London, Elizabeth was a clear and lawful heir under Henry VIII's succession arrangements. It is told that Mary's reign had been marked by religious persecution, political isolation, and a lot of economic strain. Elizabeth's survival alone had often seemed uncertain, which made her smooth succession all the more remarkable. Just under 2 months later, her coronation took place, not as a rushed formality, but carefully choreographed statement of stability, legitimacy, and renewal. So it was a big PR campaign. Bit on the coronation itself. Elizabeth's coronation was not just a ceremony, it was a signal to the nations. The procession through London was rich in symbolism, emphasizing rightful rule, learning and moderation. One particularly telling moment saw Elizabeth, according to the written accounts, pause to listen to a child delivering speech in English rather than Latin. So this was her sort of deliberate message about accessibility and reform. So let's talk about detectorists' finds for the Elizabeth I reign. And actually, it was my Elizabeth I hammered, which was the first hammered I ever found. When detectorists find Elizabethan hammered silver, one thing often stands out straight away. So her face is frequently rubbed smooth. And that wear tells a story. So when you're identifying Elizabeth I coin, hammered coin, when the portrait is gone, you should look around the edges, any partial legends, any lettering that you can see that might read as Elizabeth, or the letters DG, or Regina, long cross or a shield on the reverse, and the flans, which is actually the name for the blank coin of silver before it gets hammered, is often thin and irregular. You're going to be looking at sort of a light grey silver toning, which was typical of Tudor issues. A strong reverse and a weak obverse is entirely normal for the period, so you might often find one side has more detail than the other, or not at all. To date an Elizabethan coin, when there isn't really a clear portrait, there's a few other signs and clues on there. If you want to look out for some mint marks, so within the coin, and if you look up or if you have one of the coin books, such as Coins of England by Spink, there's a lot of detail in there on what you can look for these hammered coins. So you might see little mint marks as crosses, roses, bells, or martlets. Then you can look those up to see where it corresponds to being the mint within the country. The lettering styles, and they evolve across the reign for Elizabeth and for all previous kings and queens. And the shield shapes and layouts, so they changed over time as well. So there's a few clues there that you can look up bit by bit if you can't quite identify who the royal portrait is of on the coins. So why are Elizabeth coins often more worn than medieval ones? So there's a few reasons. Elizabethan coins stayed in circulation for an exceptionally long time. Many continue to be used well into the reign of James I. They didn't take the time to change all of the silver coins back then at the time when one royal went and another came to the throne. Unlike medieval coinage, which was frequently recalled and reissued, Elizabethan silver was allowed to circulate until it physically wore out. These coins were the everyday money for a growing population, and it was expanding trade and changing economy. So a flat Elizabeth obverse usually means that the coin outlived its monarch. It can be also a sign that within the ground that it's been sat for the last few hundred years. It might have degraded a bit over time in the soil there. Elizabeth I would go on to rule for 44 years, oversee the defeat of the Spanish Armada, preside over a cultural golden age. But it all began on this week in January 1559. So that's 466 years ago. I went over to the Royal Museum's Greenwich website which is fantastic. Spectacular illustrations over there. So go and check it out. It's rmg.co.uk, Romeo Mike Golf.co.uk. Go check it out. But some of the facts and the myths about Elizabeth. So one of the myths was that she had many lovers, and famously Elizabeth lived and died as the Virgin Queen, resistant to being married off and obviously childless. However, Elizabeth did have many favourites and close friends. Some of those close friends including Robert Dudley, Walter Raleigh, Francis Drake, Robert Devereux, as well as some dominant suitors, including many of the crown rulers of Europe and their heirs. I mean, how can you be sure that's a myth, right? Elizabeth could have been getting up to all sorts, you just don't know. Oh yeah, there you go. It now tells me. We never know if Elizabeth had non-platonic relationships with any of them, but no evidence has ever conclusively proved that she took lovers or companions before or after taking the crown. I think she's going to have advertised it, right? She was being watched like a hawk. Another one is Elizabeth loved a sweet, and that's a fact. Apparently, she had a notoriously sweet tooth and had a particular taste for candied violets. Eventually, the sugar cane caused many of her teeth to go black. Elizabeth spoke and read of at least 7 languages, and that's a fact. Apparently, she could speak or read English, Welsh, Greek, Latin, Spanish, French, and Italian. There you go. She was very clever. Much more clever than I. Elizabeth nearly married Thomas Seymour, and apparently that's a fact. So Thomas Seymour, he was the husband of her father, Henry VIII's final wife, which was Catherine Parr, and the uncle of her younger half-brother, Edward VI, was executed for attempting to get the young Elizabeth to marry him. Thomas, you devil. Well, to this day, we only have partial accounts of what took place between them. Elizabeth was a natural redhead, that's a fact. There's some striking images that I'll share on the YouTube version of this episode, where she has the famous red hair and very, very white makeup on her face. So we know that she suffered from smallpox when she was a child and she had a lot of scarring. But also it was the fashion and the trend to cake on all of this white makeup so you looked as fair as possible, because that was a sign of nobility. The fairer you were, the more you were proving you didn't have to toil and work in the fields, and you wouldn't, have a tan because of all that working in the sun. That actually probably led to some of her ill health, because that white makeup that they used was pretty much lead-based, and she was just whacking on her face, as they all were, to look very noble and to cover those smallpox scars. Okay, another rumour was that Elizabeth was a murder suspect, and that is a fact. Elizabeth came under suspicion when the wife of her favourite, or one of her favourites, Robert Dudley, died under mysterious circumstances. So this story has become a favourite, apparently, for writers of mysteries and thrillers to explore in their novels. Very interesting. But there's a very famous speech that Elizabeth first made. This was when they feared being invaded by Spain. It's called the Tilbury speech. Now, Robert Dudley, who was put in charge of the land army at Tilbury on the Thames to the east of London in Essex, got her to go to Tilbury to make this speech. It was a rally of the troops, and that took place on the 9th of August 1588. The speech went something like this: "My loving people, we have been persuaded by some that are careful of our safety to take heed how we commit ourselves to armed multitudes for fear of treachery. But I assure you I do not desire to live to distrust my faithful and loving people. Let tyrants fear. I have always so behaved myself that under God I have placed my chiefest strength and safeguard in the loyal hearts and good will of my subjects. Therefore I come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst of the heat of battle to live and die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and my kingdom, my people, my honour and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms, I myself will be your general, judge, and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field. I know already for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you, on a word of a prince, they should duly be paid. In the meantime, my lieutenant general shall be in my stead, than whom never prince commanded a more noble or worthy subject, not doubting but by your obedience to my general, by your concord in the camp and your valour in the field, we shall shortly have a famous victory over those enemies of my God, my kingdom, and my people. Wow. Did that give you goosebumps? Gave me goosebumps. So, as we know, and history tells us, and we're not speaking Spanish, she was victorious. Europe was stunned that such a small island nation, had successfully defended itself against such a major aggressor. And while the war with Spain actually continued till 1604, there was no outcome that could be taken for granted. And of course, Elizabeth was victorious. So I wonder, was Elizabeth I a popular queen? From records and looking on that same site or the Britannica site, it shows that she was a relatively popular queen during and after her lifetime. Apparently she had some affectionate monikers that she earned. She had a good relationship with Parliament. They gave her a nickname of Gloriana or Queen Bess. She wasn't popular with everyone, however. Catholics weren't happy with her, the Protestants weren't happy with her, but she tried to keep that middle ground. And then towards the last decade of her reign, there were quite a few issues in England. There were issues with harvest, there were issues with unemployment, and there were issues with economic inflation. That familiar story, hey? So, yeah, there you go. This week in history, way back when, on the 15th of January 1559, was the coronation of Elizabeth I. I hope you're going to enjoy the midweek series. They're going to be little short snippets, just something to keep you going until the next main episode. Please follow the podcast. If you can click follow on your Spotify or your podcasts, or even if you're watching on YouTube, it really helps the podcast. Within the podcast platforms, you can only get advertising when you get to a certain number of listenership. I'm so close now. So if you could just press follow, I'd be so grateful. That will mean that the episodes, when they drop, will be there waiting for you on your podcast player of choice, and it will help me out. But remember, if you need any help with your detecting supplies, check out Regton. Give the guys there a call, maybe speak to Seb, maybe speak to Marcus. They will give you some great advice. And if you want 10% off on some items, not all items, unfortunately, you can use the promo code when you're shopping online, DH Podcast. So DH for Detecting History, or Delta Hotel Podcast. Hopefully that you'll have some pennies to spend at the end of the month when we all get paid. I will speak to you soon. Take care. Bye.